At 6:14 that morning, my Honda Civic was still running outside Terminal 3 at Reagan National Airport because I couldn't remember if I'd put the car in park. That sounds dramatic now, but it wasn't at the time. My brain had simply stopped prioritizing normal things somewhere between the oncology clinic and the airport pickup lane. I still had the paper wrist fan from Walter Reed scratching against my skin, and the folder Dr. Eris handed me sat open on the passenger seat beside a half-finished gas station coffee that tasted like burnt pennies. Stage 3 lymphoma, aggressive but treatable. Chemotherapy starts Thursday at 8:30 a.m. sharp. I'd heard every word clearly. That was the weird part. People think bad news feels blurry and cinematic. It doesn't. It feels administrative. Like somebody handing you a stack of paperwork while your body quietly leaves the chat. Outside my windshield, my parents looked like they were heading to a luxury retirement commercial. My mother wore white linen pants that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill, plus a ridiculous floppy sun hat she'd bought specifically for European lighting. My father stood beside two matching caramel-colored leather suitcases, with that relaxed posture people only have when they've never been responsible for solving anyone else's problems. Meanwhile, I had a PET scan appointment highlighted in yellow. Life moves fast. My phone was still connected to the Bluetooth speaker in the car when my mother answered my call. I could hear airport announcements echoing behind her and the wheels of luggage rattling across tile floors. "Sweetheart, where are y'all?" she asked. "Your father's trying to find the passport holder." I watched her through the glass entrance while she said it. "I'm outside," I told her. "Oh, why didn't you come in?" "Because I'd spent the last 40 minutes trying not to throw up into a Dunkin' bag." Instead, I said, "Mom, I just left the doctor." There was a pause. Not a scared pause. More like a distracted pause. The kind somebody makes when checking a restaurant reservation online. "Well, what did they say?" I looked down at the schedule again, even though I already memorized it during the drive over. Blood work Wednesday. Port placement Thursday morning. First chemo infusion immediately after. My entire next 4 months had been reduced to appointment times and side effect warnings. "It's lymphoma," I said. "Stage 3. A baggage cart screeched somewhere behind her. "Oh my God." Her voice finally changed a little. Not enough, but a little. I waited for the normal questions. "Are you okay? What do you need? Do you want us to come home?" Instead, she asked, "Are they sure?" I almost laughed. Like cancer was a restaurant order somebody might mixed up. Dr. Eris had spent 20 minutes walking me through scan results while pointing at glowing white masses on a monitor the size of my dining room window. Pretty confident guy, honestly. "They want me to start chemo in 2 days," I said quietly. "I was wondering if maybe you and Dad could postpone the cruise for a little while. Just the first treatment, maybe." I watched her adjust her sunglasses in the reflection of the airport doors. Then came the sigh. Not a devastated sigh, not a frightened sigh, an irritated one. The kind my mother used whenever customer service workers ruined her day by existing too slowly. "Clara," she said carefully, "Haley's engagement dinner is on the ship Saturday night." I stared at the steering wheel. My knuckles had gone white without me noticing. She already mailed custom welcome boxes to everyone attending. We can't just cancel now. There are moments when your body understands something before your brain does. Mine happened right there in airport traffic beside a shuttle bus that smelled like diesel fumes and wet concrete. They were still going. Not even hesitation. Not even fake deliberation. Just logistics. I watched my father laugh at something on his phone while my mother continued explaining why the timing was unfortunate for everybody involved. "She's already been under so much stress planning this wedding," she added. "You know how emotional Haley gets." Haley cried once because the florist brought peonies with too much pink undertone. I wish that were a joke. "I'm starting chemotherapy on Thursday," I repeated. "Yes, sweetheart, and we'll call every day, like I was leaving for summer camp instead of preparing for chemicals designed to almost kill me before hopefully stopping the cancer first. A taxi honked behind me. Hard. I realized I'd been sitting motionless in the pickup lane too long. My mother lowered her voice slightly. "You're strong, Clara. You've always been the independent one." That sentence had followed me my entire life. Haley needed support. Haley needed understanding. Haley needed patience. I got labeled independent around age 12 because I stopped asking for things after realizing the answer was usually no unless it benefited family photos. Independent kids save everybody money. I watched my parents disappear toward TSA pre-check while I sat there holding my chemo schedule like a parking ticket. Neither of them turned around, not once. The crazy part is, I still drove home thinking maybe they'd call back, after security with guilt finally kicking in. Maybe my dad would say this felt wrong. Maybe my mother would suddenly remember she had another daughter besides the decorative one. Instead, 37 minutes later, Haley texted the family group chat a selfie holding a mimosa at an airport lounge. Vacation mode! 3 exclamation marks buzz. I looked at that message while sitting in my townhouse driveway, with the engine still running, and realized something colder than the diagnosis itself. Cancer wasn't the worst thing that happened to me that morning. It was finally understanding exactly how little I mattered to the people who raised me. Have you ever realized someone only loved the version of you that required nothing from them? Comment below. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life without the people who were supposed to protect you, subscribe to the channel. You're gonna understand this story. By the second infusion, I stopped bringing my phone charger because nobody I actually wanted to hear from was calling anyway. The oncology ward on the 4th floor of Walter Reed smelled exactly the same every single morning: bleach, microwaved eggs from the nurse's station, and stale coffee that had probably been sitting on a burner since 4:45 a.m. The fluorescent lights were aggressive enough to make everybody look either exhausted or recently interrogated by federal agents. Most of us were both. My chemo sessions started at 8:30 sharp every Thursday, and by week 3, I'd developed the strange military skill of treating cancer like an additional duty assignment. Show up early, stay organized. Don't complain in public, throw up privately. The blanket they gave me during infusions felt like recycled sandpaper. I still used it every time. Across from my chair sat a retired Navy mechanic named Leon who flirted shamelessly with every nurse under 55 and kept sneaking the daughter to donuts despite being diabetic. 2 chairs down, a woman in her 20s watched true crime documentaries while holding an IV bag full of chemicals with one hand and a Chick-fil-A milkshake with the other. Cancer wards kill your ability to judge people. Everybody's just trying to survive in whatever weird little way still works. Around week 4, my hair started coming out in the shower in thick clumps that clogged the drain almost immediately. I stood there at 6:12 in the morning, staring at wet strands wrapped around my fingers while the water went cold against my back. Then I calmly grabbed a trash bag and electric clippers. No dramatic crying, no movie moment. I buzzed my head in 7 minutes flat because I didn't have the energy to emotionally negotiate with dead hair follicles before sunrise. I showed up to physical training the next Monday wearing my patrol cap lower than usual. Nobody said anything at first. Soldiers are weirdly respectful around pain they can't fix. Then Staff Sergeant David Miller walked beside me during cool-down laps and handed me a black coffee without asking questions. "You pull off bald better than I do," he said. That was it. No pity voice, no forced inspiration speech. Just a middle-aged infantry guy built like somebody carved him from an old tree stump, offering caffeine and sarcasm before 700. Honestly, it helped more than therapy. David was 42, divorced, permanently tired-looking, and had the knees of a 70-year-old Home Depot manager after 3 deployments and 20 years in the Army. He also somehow became the person sitting beside my chemo chair almost every Thursday afternoon. At first, I told him he didn't need to do that. Then I stopped saying it, because around hour 4 of an infusion, when your bones feel filled with wet cement and your stomach starts negotiating surrender terms, having another human quietly slide you ice chips matters more than pride. He never treated me like I was fragile. One afternoon, my blood pressure dropped hard enough that the room tilted sideways when I tried standing up. A nurse rushed over while David steadied the IV pole with one hand and pressed 2 fingers against my wrist like he'd done this 100 times before. "You're pale as drywall," he muttered. "I'm thriving." "Sure you are, Captain," the nurse laughed. So did I somehow. That became the rhythm of those 16 weeks. Chemicals, nausea, dark humor. Repeat. Meanwhile, my family transferred into a travel influencer cult. I know that because Haley uploaded every single second of that Mediterranean cruise online like the FBI, required visual proof they'd consumed enough imported alcohol. Santorini sunsets, wine tastings in Naples, my mother posing beside marble fountains wearing giant sunglasses that made her look like a disappointed insect. One night, around 1:17 a.m., I made the mistake of scrolling through the photos while sitting on my bathroom floor, waiting to stop vomiting long enough to sip water. 104 pictures. I counted them because chemo does strange things to your brain. Picture 87 was my favorite. My parents smiling at some rooftop restaurant in Florence while my mother captioned it. Family is everything. That almost impressed me. The confidence required to publicly lie like that should qualify as a military skill. I stopped responding to family texts after week 6. Not dramatically. I just ran out of usable emotional bandwidth. Haley sent messages like, "You should totally try ginger chews." Mom says positive thinking helps immunity. Dad says stay hydrated. Amazing advice from the people currently treating my cancer like an inconvenient scheduling conflict. Meanwhile, David sat beside me during infusions reading outdated hunting magazines and occasionally updating me on stupid unit gossip. Apparently, one lieutenant accidentally emailed a shirtless Jim selfie to the battalion distribution list. That story alone carried me through 2 hours of nausea. There's something deeply humbling about realizing the people keeping you emotionally alive aren't your relatives. They're exhausted soldiers eating vending machine peanuts beside your IV machine because they don't want you sitting there alone. One Thursday evening after treatment, I finally asked David why he kept showing up. He shrugged without looking up from his coffee. Because somebody should. Simple answer. Military people do that sometimes. They skip emotional TED Talks and go straight to the truth. I spent most of my life believing family automatically meant loyalty, blood, holidays, shared last names. That whole suburban bumper sticker package my mother loved performing for neighbors. Cancer burned that idea straight out of me. Real loyalty looked like somebody memorizing your nausea medication schedule because you were too tired to think clearly. Real loyalty looked like a staff sergeant quietly carrying your grocery bags upstairs after chemo because your legs shook too badly to manage stairs safely. Real loyalty looked like silence that didn't demand repayment. By week 16, I understood something that honestly hurt worse than the biopsies. My biological family had fully outsourced my survival to the United States Army, and the soldiers did a better job. I rolled the last coat of paint onto my living room wall at 9:42 on a Sunday night and realized I could finally breathe without tasting metal, not dramatically, not movie style, just normally. The townhouse smelled like fresh paint, lemon cleaner, and takeout Thai food because I'd spent the entire weekend repainting every room myself instead of throwing some I beat cancer celebration dinner like people kept suggesting. Honestly, after 7 months of hospitals, sympathy faces, and medical paperwork, the last thing I wanted was sheet cake and forced inspiration speeches from coworkers. I wanted quiet. I wanted my house to stop looking like a temporary recovery station. During treatment, everything had turned functional. Folding laundry piled on dining chairs, prescription bottles lined up beside the sink like tiny chemical soldiers. Half-dead grocery store flowers from well-meaning people dried out on countertops while I slept through entire weekends. By spring, I was finally strong enough to reclaim the place. So I painted. Living room first, then the hallway, then the guest bedroom nobody ever used because my family treated visiting me like an unpaid internship. There was something satisfying about covering old walls after surviving something ugly. Not symbolic, just practical. The day Dr. Eris told me my scans came back clear, he smiled like a man cautiously exiting a hostage negotiation. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you officially get to stop seeing me so often." Best sentence I heard all year. I thanked him, scheduled follow-up labs 3 months out, and drove straight to Home Depot wearing Army PT gear and a ball cap because I still looked like a boiled egg with eyebrows. Nobody there cared. That was the beauty of America sometimes. You could survive cancer in the morning and spend the afternoon arguing with a retired electrician named Rick about eggshell versus satin finish paint like nothing happened. Civilization continues. My parents, meanwhile, returned from Europe with exactly the amount of emotional depth you'd expect from people who considered Mediterranean cruises a personality trait. At first, there was silence. Not hostile silence. Worse, avoidant silence. Like everybody had collectively agreed. My chemotherapy was one of those awkward family incidents nobody should bring up at Thanksgiving next to the sweet potatoes. Then little texts started appearing. "Mom, Haley found the most beautiful wedding venue in Alexandria, Dad. Your sister's mortgage rate is criminal. Kids today have it rough. Nothing about the cancer. Nothing about missing every infusion. Nothing about the fact I spent Thanksgiving eating hospital turkey beside an IV pump while they toured wineries outside Florence. Apparently, we were all just moving forward now. Convenient system. The first time I saw my parents in person after treatment ended happened at Haley's housewarming party in Fairfax. She'd purchased a 4-bedroom colonial she absolutely could not afford, but apparently granite countertops become spiritually necessary once women discover Pinterest weddings. I almost didn't go. Then David said something during lunch break that stuck with me. Sometimes showing up calm makes people more uncomfortable than screaming. He wasn't wrong. So I went. Haley opened the door wearing cream-colored loungewear that probably cost $200 and immediately hugged me like we were starring in a pharmaceutical commercial. "Oh my God, your hair's growing back so cute." Thanks, I almost died for it. The house smelled like vanilla candles and financial irresponsibility. Everywhere I looked, there were unopened boxes, expensive furniture, and decorative items with absolutely no survival value whatsoever. My father stood in the kitchen, pouring wine while discussing property taxes like civilization itself depended on suburban zoning laws. Then my mother saw me. For 1 second, I honestly thought maybe something real would finally happen. Maybe guilt, maybe shame, maybe even a basic human apology. Instead, she smiled carefully and said, "You look much healthier." That was it. Like I'd spent the winter recovering from seasonal allergies instead of having poison pumped into my bloodstream every week. I nodded once. "So do you." Cold, simple, finished. The weird thing about disappointment is eventually it burns itself out completely. People think betrayal always feels explosive, but most of the time it's just exhausting. At some point, your brain stops trying to collect emotional debt from people who were never planning to pay it anyway. Dinner that night was surreal. Haley spent 20 straight minutes explaining backsplash tile options, while my mother complained about cruise passengers who dressed tacky at formal dinner night. My father argued with Zillow estimates after his 3rd bourbon. Nobody asked what chemotherapy felt like. Nobody asked if I'd been scared. Nobody asked who drove me home after procedures. It almost became funny. Like we were all participating in the world's most passive-aggressive hostage negotiation, where everybody knew the truth, but agreed not to mention the body in the room. At one point, Haley laughed and said, "Well, at least last year's behind us now. Last year. That's how categorized cancer. Like bad weather." I looked around that oversized dining room and finally understood something important about my family. They did not process pain. They managed optics. As long as unpleasant things stayed emotionally invisible, they could continue pretending our family was normal, successful, loving, stable. I stopped expecting apologies after that night. Not because I forgave them, because I reclassified them. That's the closest phrase I can find for it. Military life teaches you compartmentalization early, threat assessment, access control, perimeter management. You learn very quickly that not everybody gets clearance to sensitive areas. My parents lost theirs permanently. After that, I answered texts politely but slowly. I stopped volunteering personal details. I never discussed follow-up scans, lingering fatigue, or the fact certain food smells still made me nauseous months later. Surface-level conversations only. Weather, traffic, mortgage rates, safe topics. Emotionally, they became distant relatives I happened to share DNA with instead of people emotionally responsible for me. And honestly, the silence protected me better than forgiveness ever could. Because once you stop begging people to become who they should have been, you finally get your energy back. The voicemail came in at 11:48 p.m. while I was ironing my dress uniform for a logistics briefing the next morning. I almost ignored it because Haley never called that late unless somebody had either gotten engaged, divorced, or trapped inside a luxury SUV lease agreement. Turns out it was option 4, panic. I listened to the message twice while standing in my kitchen beside a container of leftover chicken fried rice and a perfectly folded pair of army slacks. "Clara, call me back, please. It's Dad." Her voice sounded wrong immediately. Too fast, too thin. The way people sound when their entire worldview has just been introduced to consequences. I called her back. She answered on the first ring. Oh my God, finally. No hello, no build-up. Just desperation breathing directly into the phone. Apparently, my father had collapsed during a charity golf tournament in McLean 3 days earlier. At first, everybody thought it was dehydration, because wealthy suburban men treat chest pain like an optional opinion until somebody physically loads them into an ambulance. Turns out he had a severe degenerative cardiac condition involving restricted blood flow through multiple arteries and damage to one of his valves. I don't remember the exact terminology because Haley explained it while openly sobbing into what sounded like a leather car seat. What I did understand was this: without surgery, things were bad. Without a very specific surgery, things would get worse fast. The procedure itself cost around $215,000 before rehabilitation, specialist follow-ups, medication, and whatever exciting surprise charges American hospitals like stapling onto invoices afterward. God bless this healthcare system. I leaned against the kitchen counter while Haley spiraled through half-finished explanations. They said Medicare won't fully cover the newer procedure because it's still considered experimental adjacent or something. I don't know. And Dad's supplemental insurance is terrible, and slow down. Silence. Then came the real problem. My parents were broke. Not visibly broke. Not selling plasma behind a strip mall, broke. More like upper-middle-class suburban collapse disguised under expensive sweaters and credit card points. Over the next 15 minutes, the entire Jenkins family illusion peeled apart like cheap wallpaper. The wedding had cost somewhere around $96,000. $96,000. For one afternoon. Apparently there had been live string musicians, imported flower walls, custom ice sculptures, and miniature champagne bottles engraved with Haley and Ethan's initials, because nothing says eternal love like personalized alcohol containers. Then came the house, then the furniture financing, then the honeymoon in Bora Bora, then the kitchen remodel my mother insisted was necessary for entertaining. Every financial decision in my family had always been treated like future consequences were a problem for less glamorous people. Now future consequences had arrived carrying medical paperwork. They took out 3 different lines of credit. Haley admitted quietly. I closed my eyes. 3? 1 for the wedding, 1 for the remodel, 1 for hesitated. For what? The Mercedes. Of course there was a Mercedes. My father spent 30 years lecturing me about fiscal discipline while apparently financing luxury vehicles like a divorced dentist in a midlife crisis. Beautiful. And now Mom's freaking out because they don't qualify for some of the assistance programs, Haley continued. They make too much on paper. On paper. That phrase almost made me laugh. My parents had spent their entire lives protecting appearances, the right neighborhood, the right country club memberships, the right vacations posted online at exactly the right angles. Turns out, none of that impresses cardiologists. The following Saturday, I drove to their house for the first time in almost 8 months. The neighborhood still looked aggressively prosperous. Perfect lawns, oversized SUVs, men named Greg pressure-washing driveways while listening to financial podcasts. My mother opened the front door before I even knocked fully. And for the first time in my life, Miriam Jenkins looked old. Not physically old exactly, more like structurally exhausted. The kind of tired that settles into wealthy people once they realize money might not solve the problem this time. Her sweater still matched the decor, though. Priorities. Oh, thank God, she whispered, hugging me too quickly. That alone told me things were serious. My mother only touched people voluntarily during funerals and Christmas card photography. Inside the house, everything still looked expensive and emotionally sterile: marble countertops, decorative bowls nobody used, furniture arranged like they were staging the property for resale. But little cracks had started showing. Unopened medical envelopes stacked beside the sink, pill bottles near the coffee maker. A final notice from American Express partially hidden beneath a Pottery Barn catalog. My father sat in a recliner near the living room window wearing a navy cardigan and the defeated expression of a man discovering mortality doesn't care how much he spent on landscaping. He looked smaller. That unsettled me more than I expected. Hey, kiddo, he said weakly. Kiddo. Interesting choice from a man who missed every chemo appointment. I sat across from him while my mother immediately launched into doctor names, specialist consultations, insurance disputes, and billing codes, with the frantic energy of somebody trying to outrun reality through organization. The surgery needed scheduling soon. The deposits were enormous. The insurance appeals were failing. The savings were gone. And underneath all of it sat something even uglier neither of them wanted to say out loud. They genuinely believed life would always bail them out eventually, because it always had before. I listened quietly while my mother flipped through folders full of estimates and payment plans. Every page sounded more desperate than the last. At one point, she rubbed her forehead and muttered, I just don't understand how people afford medical crises in this country. I almost choked on my coffee. That sentence coming from the woman who left for a Mediterranean cruise 48 hours before my chemotherapy started felt less like irony and more like divine comedy. But I didn't say it. Not yet. Because sitting there in that spotless kitchens, listening to financial panic finally seep through the walls of their perfect suburban life, I realized something important. This wasn't karma. Karma is fast. This was debt, and debt always collects eventually. Rain hammered against the visitor center windows, hard enough to blur the parking lot into gray watercolor streaks when the desk sergeant called my office at exactly 4:30 Tuesday afternoon. "Captain Jenkins, your mother's here. Not a visitor. Not a family member. Your mother." Even over a military phone line, those words carried a warning label. I stared at the stack of transportation manifests on my desk for a second longer than necessary before answering. "She have an appointment?" "No, Mom. Of course not." Miriam Jenkins considered appointments something other people needed. By the time I walked into the visitor's center, she was already seated at one of the cold metal tables near the vending machines, perfectly upright, both hands folded over a leather portfolio, like she was preparing to negotiate a hostage release instead of ambushing her daughter on federal property. She wore a camel-colored trench coat that probably cost more than junior enlisted soldiers made in a week. Her makeup looked professionally applied, but the effect collapsed slightly around the eyes. Stress had finally started collecting interest. A half-empty Starbucks cup sat beside a stack of papers thick enough to qualify as a building foundation. The moment she saw me, her face rearranged itself into something fragile and maternal. Practiced expression, decent execution. "Miriam," I said calmly. "Not Mom." Something flickered across her face when I said it. "Good, Clara." She stood quickly. "Thank you for coming down." I sat across from her without removing my patrol cap. Outside, rainwater rolled down the windows while two specialists argued quietly near the reception desk about whose turn it was to inventory damaged radio equipment. Somewhere behind us, a vending machine hummed like it had unresolved trauma. Military buildings always sound exhausted. My mother slid the folder toward me immediately. No small talk, no fake concern. Straight to business. That told me everything. Inside the folder sat heavily redacted hospital invoices, insurance denial letters, surgical estimates, and prescription summaries covered in yellow highlighter. Numbers jumped off the pages like small acts of violence. $38,407.20, $11,203.84, $67,000 estimated surgical deposit. America remains committed to the exciting tradition of financially waterboarding sick people. "I've been on the phone with insurance advocates for 6 days," my mother said quietly. "Your father's condition is progressing faster than expected." I nodded once, but didn't touch the paperwork yet. And her fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. There may be another option. There it was. Whenever wealthy people say another option, crime usually enters the conversation about 30 seconds later. She carefully removed a separate packet from the folder and pushed it toward me with almost theatrical gentleness. DFAS Dependency Determination Package. I recognized the form instantly. My stomach went cold before I even opened it fully. "You want me to register Dad as my dependent." "Secondary dependent," she corrected softly. "Temporary, essentially. That's not how federal law works, but sure." I slowly flipped through the packet while she kept talking in the same hushed voice people use when discussing tax fraud at country clubs. "If Thomas qualifies through your military benefits, he could access TRICARE Prime coverage for the procedure. We already checked. It would save." She swallowed carefully, an enormous amount. The rain outside intensified. I kept reading. Dependency verification, financial support documentation, affidavit certification under penalty of perjury, beautiful paperwork, very clear prison language. "You just need to show that you provide over 50% of his financial support," she continued quickly. "The Army doesn't investigate these things aggressively unless there's obvious abuse." I actually looked up at her then. That sentence hung in the air between us like cigarette smoke. My mother had officially reached the stage of panic where committing federal fraud sounded reasonable if explained politely enough. "Mom," I said evenly, "Dad owns a 4-bedroom house in Fairfax and drives a $70,000 Mercedes." "Leased Mercedes," she corrected automatically. I almost admired the commitment to detail. She leaned closer across the table. "Clara, please listen to me. We're drowning right now." The hospital wants advance payment guarantees before scheduling the surgery date. We've appealed twice already. We? Yes, we. Interesting words choice from a woman who once told me, everyone handles hardship differently while boarding a cruise ship during my cancer treatment. I closed the folder carefully. No. Her face tightened immediately. You didn't even think about it. I stared at her for a long second before answering. Oh, I thought about it instantly. That seemed to unsettle her more. She lowered her voice further. You're an officer. You know how paperwork works. There are ways these things get approved every day. Now came the real pitch, the justification phase. The part where unethical people explain why morality becomes flexible once consequences affect them personally. Nobody's asking you to hurt anyone, she insisted. Your father served this country too in his own way. He paid taxes his entire life. We're just trying to survive a broken system. There it was, the magic American phrase. Broken system. Amazing how wealthy people discover systemic injustice exactly 15 minutes before it affects them directly. I flipped to page 4 of the packet and read the certification statement printed in bold black ink. I certify that all statements are true and complete to the best of my knowledge. False statements may subject the signer to criminal prosecution under federal law. Clean wording. Efficient. Very Army. My mother watched my face carefully while trying to maintain composure. For the first time since sitting down, I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, not from guilt, from fear, and underneath that fear sat something even uglier. Expectation. She genuinely believed I would do this, because deep down, my family had always treated me less like a daughter and more like emergency infrastructure. The reliable one, the practical one, the one you ignored emotionally until the roof caught fire. Then suddenly I mattered again. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out my tactical pen slowly, setting it beside the paperwork. My mother exhaled in visible relief. That almost broke me laughing, because she still didn't understand what kind of person chemotherapy had turned me into. Cancer strips away a lot of things. Fear of uncomfortable truths is usually first to go. And sitting there across from the woman who left me alone during the worst months of my life, listening to her calmly request federal fraud like she was as asking for a dinner reservation, I realized something horrifying. She honestly believed this conversation made her the victim. I turned to page 4 slowly, while my mother watched me with the tense concentrations of someone waiting for a bomb technician to cut the correct wire. The visitor center had mostly emptied by then. Rain still rattled against the windows, and somewhere near the front desk, a television mounted in the corner played muted weather coverage about flash flood warnings across Northern Virginia. Nobody looked at us. That was the strange part. Life keeps moving while your family quietly implodes beside a vending machine. I adjusted the paperwork under the fluorescent lights and read every line carefully. Years in military logistics had rewired my brain to notice fine print automatically. Shipment authorizations, hazard declarations, funding certifications. Government paperwork always hid the real danger in the smallest paragraphs, and there it was. False statements punishable under Title 18 of the United States Code. Potential fines, potential imprisonment, potential administrative separation from military service. My entire career sitting politely at the bottom of page 4. I tapped the paper once with my finger. You already filled most of this out. My mother nodded too quickly. We wanted to save time. Of course they did. Several sections had already been completed in neat blue ink. Monthly support contributions, shared household dependency estimates, financial assistance claims, all fake. Not creatively fake either, lazy fake. According to this packet, I was apparently providing more than 50% of my father's living expenses, despite the fact the man still belonged to a golf club with a quarterly lobster night. Bold strategy. I flipped another page. Bank statement requirements, tax return verification, housing cost declarations. The deeper I read, the uglier the situation became. This wasn't just a technical lie. It was coordinated fraud requiring forged financial dependency documentation submitted directly through federal military systems. My mother shifted nervously in her chair. You know how these things work better than we do. That sentence almost made me smile, because she still thought this was about paperwork. It wasn't. It was about memory. I looked up at her for the first time in almost a full minute. She had the same expression she wore when I was 13 and accidentally backed her Lexus into the mailbox. Tight jaw, calculated softness. The face Miriam Jenkins used whenever she needed cooperation without accountability. You really came onto a military installation asking an army officer to commit federal fraud, I said calmly. Her eyes darted briefly toward the reception desk. Please don't say it like that. Interesting response. That's not what this is. You're misunderstanding. Just don't phrase the crime so aggressively out loud. She leaned closer and lowered her voice again. Clara, nobody is trying to scam the government. We're trying to save your father's life. There it was again, the moral shortcut. As if desperation automatically transformed dishonesty into virtue. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out my brass tactical pen slowly, setting it beside the paperwork with a soft metallic click against the table. My mother's shoulders visibly loosened. She thought I was preparing to sign. That honestly might have been the saddest moment of the entire conversation. Because despite everything, the chemo, the abandonment, the silence afterward, she still fundamentally believed access to me could be restored through need, not love. Need. I rolled the pen once between my fingers while studying her face carefully. Up close, the cracks were worse now, concealer settling unevenly beneath her eyes, tiny stress tremors in her hands. The polished suburban confidence that once controlled every room had started collapsing under debt collectors and surgical estimates. Part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then my brain pulled up a memory I hadn't thought about in over a year. Thursday morning, first chemo infusion, 8:27 a.m. I'd been sitting alone in a freezing hospital recliner, trying not to panic while an oncology nurse explained potential fertility complications. My phone buzzed halfway through the conversation. A text from my mother. Picture of a vineyard in Sicily. Caption, wish you could see this sunset. 3 exclamation marks again, amazing consistency. Back in the visitor center, I tapped the brass pen lightly against the table once. Then again. My mother watched every movement. You know what's interesting? I asked quietly. She blinked. What? When I had cancer, nobody in this family suddenly became flexible with ethics to save me. Her face tightened immediately. That's not fair. No? You know that's different. I actually laughed once under my breath. Different. Right, because my illness had been emotionally inconvenient, while my father's illness threatened property values and retirement accounts. The distinction was becoming incredibly clear. She straightened in her chair, frustration starting to bleed through the performance. Your father is sick. So was I. That's not what I meant. No, I know exactly what you meant. The silence after that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Good. Military life teaches you something valuable about silence. Most people rush to fill it because they confuse discomfort with danger. But silence is useful. Silence forces people to sit beside the truth without escape routes. And the truth sitting between us was brutally simple. When I needed family, they outsourced me to nurses and soldiers. Now they needed something from me, and suddenly family mattered again. My mother's eyes dropped toward the paperwork. If we lose this surgery slot, we may not get another one quickly. I believed her. That was the hardest part. This wasn't fake suffering. My father really was sick. The bills were real. The fear was real. Human pain doesn't magically become fictional just because the people experiencing it behaved terribly beforehand. That's what makes moral decisions difficult as an adult. Bad people still bleed, but consequences bleed too. I picked up the dependency packet one final time and looked at the forged financial numbers already waiting for my signatures. Every line represented another calculation. Somebody assumed I'd absorb quietly because I was the dependable daughter, the practical daughter, the one trained to carry heavy things. What nobody in my family ever understood was this. The army taught me logistics. Cancer taught me limits. And together, they made me very difficult to manipulate. I slid the unsigned paperwork back across the metal table slowly enough that my mother had time to understand exactly what was happening. The folder stopped directly in front of her Starbucks cup, still untouched. That somehow felt symbolic. No, I said calmly, absolutely not. For a second, she just stared at me, not angry yet, not emotional yet, just confused in the purest sense of the word, like her brain physically couldn't process resistance because she'd already categorized this situation as solved the moment she drove onto base. Then came the blinking, fast, defensive. Clara, I'm not falsifying federal dependency documents. You're overreacting. I almost smiled at that. Federal prison apparently counted as overreacting now. I tapped page 4 lightly with the brass pen again. This affidavit is submitted through DFAS and reviewed under military benefits fraud regulations, I said evenly. Perjury against the federal government carries up to 5 years in prison, depending on the charges involved. The color drained from her face slightly. You make it sound criminal. I looked directly at her. It is criminal. The rains outside softened into a steady hiss against the windows. Somewhere near the front desk, a young private laughed too loudly at something on his phone before immediately getting yelled at by a sergeant. Normal life continued. Meanwhile, my mother sat frozen across from me, trying to emotionally negotiate with federal law. You wouldn't actually go to prison, she whispered. That sentence told me everything. She hadn't come here asking whether something was right. She'd already decided it was survivable. There's a certain type of privileged person who believes rules are mostly decorative until consequences become personal. My parents spent decades existing inside that worldview. Parking tickets disappeared under money. Debt got refinanced. Mistakes became setbacks. Somebody always fixed things eventually. Usually me. Not this time. I capped the pen carefully and slipped it back into my pocket. I'm not risking my commission, my clearance, or my career because you and Dad treated credit cards like monopoly money. That hit harder than I expected. Her expression cracked immediately. We were trying to give Haley a beautiful life. There it was. Not denial, justification, as if overspending on imported flower walls and luxury vehicles somehow transformed into noble parenting once phrased emotionally enough. You gave Haley a wedding with ice sculptures, I said. Now you need experimental cardiac surgery and suddenly financial planning matters. That's cruel. No. Cruel was leaving your daughter alone during chemotherapy because cruise reservations were non-refundable. Her eyes widened sharply. The first direct hit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then the tears started. Fast, precise, almost theatrical in timing. My mother covered her mouth with one hand as her shoulders trembled dramatically enough that I almost expected soft violin music to begin playing over the bass speakers. Your father could die, she whispered. I stayed still, completely still. That seemed to upset her more than yelling would. Do you understand me? She snapped suddenly. He could die. Clara, yes. And you're seriously sitting here talking about paperwork? No, I said quietly. I'm talking about choices. That landed. Hard. She straightened in her chair, anger finally pushing through the panic. A good daughter would do whatever's necessary to save her father's life. There it was. Family duty. The emergency weapon people suddenly pull out once manipulation fails politely. I looked at her for several long seconds before answering. Then I adjusted the gold captain's bars on my uniform collar carefully, smoothing the fabric beneath them out of habit. I spent 4 months vomiting into hospital trash cans, I said softly. Mostly alone. Her jaw tightened. You know that's unfair, is it? We called you every day. I laughed once under my breath. The sound surprised even me. Called me. Like emotional voicemail, counted as caregiving. I remembered sitting under fluorescent hospital lights at 2:11 in the morning after one particularly brutal infusion, while a nurse named Carla helped untangle my IV tubing, because my hands were shaking too badly to manage it myself. Meanwhile, my family was posting wine photos from Rome. Family duty apparently had geographic restrictions. My mother's tears became angrier now. You survived. That sentence hit the table between us like broken glass. Not because she meant harm intentionally, because she genuinely didn't understand what she'd admitted. You survived. As if survival retroactively erased abandonment. As if making it through something meant the people who disappeared during it deserved absolution automatically. I leaned back slightly in the metal chair and looked at her the same way I'd evaluate unstable supply chain reports before deployment. Calmly, carefully, without emotion clouding the math. You know what nobody tells you about cancer? I asked quietly. She said nothing. The worst part isn't always the treatment. I could still remember the smell of antiseptic wipes, the freezing blankets, the way nausea crawled up your throat before sunrise. But honestly, none of that broke me permanently. What stayed with me was learning exactly who considered my suffering negotiable. I learned something during chemo, I continued. People show you who they are fastest when helping you becomes inconvenient. Her face twisted immediately. So this is revenge? No, I shook my head once. This is a boundary. Another silence settled over the table, heavier this time, final. My mother stared at me like she genuinely no longer recognized the person sitting across from her. And maybe she didn't. The version of me she understood had disappeared somewhere between biopsy results and military hospital hallways. Cancer changes your tolerance for emotional dishonesty permanently. Finally, she whispered, I can't believe you'd abandon your own family. That one almost impressed me. The confidence required to accuse me of abandonment after leaving me alone during chemotherapy deserved some kind of Olympic recognition. I stood slowly, buttoning my uniform jacket fully. Then I looked directly at the woman who raised me and spoke as calmly as I ever had in my life. I cannot illegally insure the people who left me to die. No yelling, no drama. Just truth. And truth sounds a lot colder when nobody can argue with it. My mother stared at me for several seconds after I said it. Not speaking. Not blinking much either. Just sitting there with mascara beginning to break apart beneath fluorescent lighting, while the unsigned dependency packet rested between us like a failed business proposal. Then something strange happened. She stopped performing. The tears stayed, but the theater disappeared. For the first time all afternoon, Miriam Jenkins looked less like a polished suburban matriarch and more like an aging woman who had finally run out of exits. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I did. That was the problem." I picked up my patrol cap from the table and stood slowly, smoothing the front of my dress uniform automatically. Years in the army condition you to reset yourself physically before difficult moments. Straight collar, clean posture, neutral expression. Control first, emotion later. Outside the visitor center windows, the rain had finally stopped. Water still clung to the pavement in silver streaks beneath the parking lot lights, and soldiers crossed the wet sidewalks, carrying backpacks and energy drinks like any other Tuesday evening on base. The world kept moving. It always does. My mother stood too quickly, panic returning now that she realized the conversation was actually ending. "So that's it?" she asked sharply. "You're just going to let your father die?" "No," I answered calmly. "I'm refusing to commit fraud. That's not the same thing. It is when prison time gets involved." Her voice rose immediately. "You care more about regulations than your own family." A staff sergeant near the entrance glanced over briefly before deciding this was above his pay grade and returning to his phone. Smart man. I buttoned the front of my uniform jacket completely and looked at my mother without anger anymore. That was the weirdest part of all this. Somewhere during the conversation, the anger had burned itself out entirely. What remained was clarity. Not revenge, not cruelty, just clarity. "I spent 16 weeks in oncology treatment," I said quietly. "Do you know who drove me home after my port surgery?" She crossed her arms defensively. "That's irrelevant. It was Sergeant Miller." Her jaw tightened. "Do you know who sat beside me when my blood pressure dropped during chemo?" Silence. "Do you know who brought groceries when I couldn't walk upstairs without shaking?" Still silence. I nodded once. Not my family. My mother's face hardened immediately, the way people react when truth corners them too efficiently. "We called you constantly. You called from cruise ships." "That was one trip." I almost laughed. One trip. As if abandonment becomes smaller once compressed into vacation terminology. She stepped closer toward the table, lowering her voice again like she should still negotiate this emotionally. "You survived, Clara. Your father might not." There it was again. The equation she kept trying to force into place. "You lived, therefore your suffering counts less." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You keep talking like survival erased what happened." She opened her mouth immediately. I didn't let her interrupt. "You don't get to disappear when things are ugly and then suddenly demand loyalty during your own emergency." The words landed hard enough that even she stopped trying to argue for a second. Because underneath all the financial panic and medical fear, my mother understood exactly what this was really about. Not insurance, not paperwork, access. She had spent years assuming parenthood guaranteed permanent emotional access to me, regardless of behavior. That blood relation functioned like a lifetime membership card, no matter how selfish or absent they became. But adulthood changes that math, especially after cancer. I glanced toward the security desk near the entrance and gave a small nod. The base security officer standing nearby, professional guy, mid-50s maybe, calm face, former military judging by the posture. He immediately understood the assignment. My mother noticed too. "You're seriously throwing me out?" she asked, horrified. "No," I said evenly. "I'm ending the meeting." The officer approached slowly, respectful but alert. "Mom," he said gently to my mother, "I can escort you to the parking area." She looked at him like he'd personally betrayed her. Then she turned back toward me one last time. "I hope you can live with yourself." That sentence followed me all the way into adulthood from childhood onward. Whenever my mother didn't get what she wanted, morality suddenly became everybody else's burden to carry. But this time, something inside me stayed completely still. Because for once, I actually could live with myself. The security officer guided her toward the exit, while she continued crying quietly into the expensive tissues pulled from her designer handbag. Right before the doors opened, she looked back again, like she expected me to stop everything dramatically at the final second. Movies train people badly. Real boundaries are usually quiet. The doors closed behind them with a soft hydraulic hiss. And that was it. No screaming match, no emotional collapse, no triumphant speech, just silence. I stood there for another minute, listening to the hum of vending machines and distant office chatter before finally walking outside into the cold evening air. The rain had scrubbed the entire base clean. Wet pavement reflected rows of security lights, and the air smelled like concrete, grass, and engine exhaust cooling after the storm. I breathed in deeply. Then again. For the first time in years, my chest felt light. Not happy exactly. Relief is different from happiness. Relief is setting down something heavy after carrying it so long you forgot your body was hurting. I drove home with the windows cracked, despite the cold, because I wanted fresh air inside the car. Traffic along Route 50 crawled like usual, headlights stretching endlessly across wet asphalt, while some local radio host argued about football trades with a caller from Arlington. Normal life, beautiful, ordinary normal life. Back at my townhouse, everything sat exactly where I left it. Clean counters, folded blanket on the couch, one coffee mug drying beside the sink. Peaceful in a way my parents' expensive house never managed to be. I changed out of my uniform slowly and stood for a minute in the quiet living room I painted after chemo ended. That's when I finally understood something nobody teaches you growing up. Human dignity is not something your family grants you. It's something you build yourself through decisions, through limits, through the moments you refuse to betray your own conscience just because someone else feels entitled to it. My parents spent years confusing love with access and loyalty with obligation. But love without responsibility is just performance, and family without respect is just shared DNA. I didn't destroy my family that night. I simply stopped volunteering to be crushed underneath it. They made their choices, and for the first time in my life, I let those choices belong entirely to them. A few months after everything happened, somebody at work asked me what cancer felt like. Not physically, emotionally. We were sitting outside the logistics building during lunch break, eating aggressively mediocre government chicken wraps, while two lieutenants argued nearby about printer toner like national security depended on it. And honestly, I didn't know how to answer at first, because the cancer itself wasn't the part that stayed with me the longest. The needles faded, the nausea faded. Even the scars eventually became background noise. What stayed with me was the realization that some people only love you when loving you is convenient. That changes a person permanently. I think a lot of people watching this probably understand exactly what I mean, even if your story has nothing to do with hospitals. Maybe it happened during a divorce. Maybe after losing a job. Maybe after depression, addiction, grief, bankruptcy, or one terrible year where life stopped being aesthetically pleasing enough for other people to participate in. That's when you learn who actually cares. Not during birthdays. Not during weddings. Not during Christmas photos where everybody coordinates sweaters and pretends emotional stability can be purchased at Target. You learn during ugly seasons. That's where the truth lives. Looking back now, I realize something else too. I spent most of my childhood training people to neglect me without consequences. That sounds harsh, but it's true. When you become the independent kid in a family, people start treating your silence like proof you don't need care. You become low maintenance because asking for emotional support feels embarrassing after enough rejection. So eventually, you stop asking entirely. Then everybody praises you for being so mature. Meanwhile, your nervous system is basically surviving on military-grade emotional rationing. My sister cried loudly, needed attention constantly, made dramatic decisions, and somehow the entire family reorganized itself around her moods like she was a weather system. I handled problems quietly, paid my own bills early, joined the army, stayed functional during chemotherapy, and somehow that became justification for abandonment. She's strong. Families say that sentence like it's a compliment. Sometimes it's just permission to ignore you. And before anybody misunderstands me, resilience is not a bad thing. Surviving hard situations matters. Strength matters. Discipline matters. I probably wouldn't be alive without those things. But there's a difference between being resilient and becoming emotionally invisible. A huge difference. One of the most dangerous things adults do is romanticize their own suffering afterward, because it helps them avoid grieving what should have happened instead. People told me constantly, "You're so brave. You handled it so well. You're stronger than most people." Okay. But I still shouldn't have been sitting alone in a hospital hallway after a biopsy trying to figure out how to drive myself home while half-conscious from sedation. Surviving alone is not proof you deserve to be alone. That took me years to understand. Another thing cancer stripped away from me was this fantasy that biology automatically creates loyalty. I think a lot of us grow up believing titles guarantee character. Mother, father, sister, family. But titles don't mean much without behavior behind them. A mother is not automatically nurturing. A father is not automatically protective. And family members are not automatically safe simply because you share DNA and awkward Thanksgiving memories. Honestly, some of the greatest kindness I received during treatment came from people who technically owed me nothing. Nurses who remembered I couldn't tolerate the smell of chicken broth after week 5. A pharmacist who slipped extra alcohol wipes into my medication bag because the cheap ones hurt more. David sitting beside my chemo chair talking about bass fishing and bad army coffee while pretending not to notice when I got sick halfway through conversations. That was care, not inspirational speeches, not social media sympathy posts, just consistent presence. And that's something I really want people listening to understand, because modern life confuses performance with love constantly. Real love is usually boring. It looks like showing up repeatedly without making everything about yourself. It's groceries, rides home, checking whether someone ate dinner, remembering medication schedules, sitting quietly beside somebody when there's nothing useful left to say. That stuff matters more than grand emotional declarations ever will. I also learned something uncomfortable after treatment ended. A lot of people would rather protect the image of a family than the actual health of the people inside it. My parents cared deeply about appearing successful, loving, polished, respectable. And honestly, suburban America rewards that performance all the time. Nice house, nice vacations, smiling holiday cards, everybody posting filtered happiness online while privately falling apart behind closed doors. But image cannot hold your hand in oncology. Image cannot drive you to surgery. Image cannot love you back. At some point, reality collects its debt from everybody pretending appearances matter more than relationships. That doesn't mean I hate my family now. I don't. Hate requires emotional energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. What I feel now is clarity, and clarity is quieter. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Pay attention to who stays when life becomes inconvenient. Not exciting, not impressive, not profitable. Inconvenient. Because the people who stay during those moments, those are your real people. Everybody else is just attending the performance. The strangest thing that happened after I refused to help my parents wasn't the silence. It was the guilt. Not because I thought I made the wrong decision. Deep down, I knew I hadn't. If anything, it was the first fully honest decision I'd made in years. But guilt has a way of surviving even after logic finishes speaking. Especially if you grew up in a family where boundaries were treated like personal betrayal. For weeks after the confrontation, I kept catching myself replaying the conversation while doing completely normal things. Folding laundry, sitting in traffic outside Alexandria, waiting for coffee in the base exchange while some retired colonel complained about bagel prices loud, enough to trigger a NATO response. My brain would randomly ask, what if you were too harsh? Then another part of me would answer, what exactly was the gentle version of refusing federal fraud? That usually settled it. I think a lot of people watching this understand that feeling better than they admit. You finally say no to something unhealthy, manipulative, or completely unreasonable, and somehow you still end up feeling like the villain afterward. That doesn't happen by accident. Families that rely on guilt train you slowly over time. You become responsible for everybody else's emotional stability while your own needs get treated like unfortunate scheduling conflicts. And if you're the responsible one in the family like I was, the conditioning gets even worse. People start assuming your reliability is permanent. Your patience becomes public property. Your boundaries become negotiable. Then one day you say no, and everybody acts shocked that the machine suddenly stopped working. I used to think boundaries were cold. Honestly, I thought healthy people just naturally tolerated endless emotional chaos better than I did. I assumed kindness meant availability, sacrifice, flexibility. Being the person who always absorbed the impact so everybody else stayed comfortable. That mindset nearly destroyed me, not during cancer, long before cancer. One thing I learned after treatment is that compassion without boundaries eventually turns into self-erasure. If you spend your entire life rescuing people from consequences, eventually they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as emergency infrastructure. That's exactly what happened with my parents. Notice something important about my story. Nobody suddenly cared about family duty when I was sick. That language only appeared once they needed something expensive. That matters. Because manipulative people often rediscover morality during emergencies they personally cannot survive alone. Suddenly loyalty becomes sacred. Suddenly family matters deeply. Suddenly sacrifice is noble again. Funny timing. And look, I'm not saying people shouldn't help family members. Real families help each other all the time. Healthy support systems matter. Community matters. Loyalty matters. But there's a difference between helping someone and setting yourself on fire to keep their bad decisions warm. That distinction will save your life if you learn it early enough. My parents did not end up financially desperate because of one random tragedy. My father's illness was tragic, absolutely. But the financial collapse happened because years of vanity, overspending, appearances, and emotional irresponsibility finally collided with reality. And when reality arrived, they looked for the nearest dependable person to absorb the damage. Me, again. That's another thing people need to hear clearly. Panic does not automatically make someone trustworthy. Desperate people ask for unethical things constantly, not because they're cartoon villains twisting mustaches in dark rooms. Usually it's because fear destroys perspective. Once consequences become terrifying enough, people start convincing themselves survival justifies almost anything. That's how otherwise normal adults end up asking their daughter to commit federal fraud over Starbucks in a military visitor center. Fear makes people rationalize crazy things fast, which is why one of the best real-world skills you can develop is learning not to make major decisions inside someone else's emotional emergency. Slow down, read the paperwork, call a lawyer, sleep on it. Because guilt creates terrible judgment, and once you sign certain documents, transfer certain money, co-sign certain loans, or lie on certain forms, your life can become legally tied to somebody else's collapse permanently. I've seen people ruin their credit, marriages, mental health, careers, and retirements, trying to rescue relatives who never would made the same sacrifice in return. That's not love. That's emotional conscription. Another uncomfortable truth: forgiveness and access are not the same thing. I think social media has completely confused people on this point. Everybody talks like healing automatically means reopening every door. Like maturity means pretending previous harm no longer matters. No. You can forgive someone internally and still decide they no longer belong close to your life. You can stop hating someone and still refuse to trust them financially, emotionally, or legally. Those are separate decisions. I don't spend my days furious at my parents anymore. Honestly, most of the time I just feel tired when I think about them. Sad sometimes too, because underneath all the anger, there's grief. Not grief because they died. Grief because I finally accepted who they actually are. That's a different kind of loss entirely. And if you're listening to this while struggling with your own family situation, I need you to hear something clearly. Protecting your peace is not cruelty. Saying no to manipulation is not selfishness. And refusing to destroy your future for people who repeatedly ignored your suffering does not make you a bad person. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is let adults experience the consequences of lives they built themselves, even when they share your last name. About a year after everything happened, I was standing in my kitchen at 6:05 on a Saturday morning making pancakes while wearing old army sweatpants and listening to rain hit the windows. Nothing dramatic was happening, no emotional breakthrough, no inspiring soundtrack, just pancakes. And honestly, that's when I realized I was finally healing. Not because life became perfect. It didn't. I still had follow-up scans every 6 months. I still got nervous in waiting rooms. Certain hospital smells still flipped a switch in my stomach instantly. Sometimes I'd wake up at 2 a.m. convinced some random ache meant the cancer had come back. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the credits roll. But my life had become peaceful in a way I'd never experienced growing up. Quiet, stable, safe. And the weirdest part? That peace started the moment I stopped chasing emotional approval from people fundamentally unwilling to give it. I think a lot of adults waste years trying to win love from emotionally unavailable people. Parents, partners, siblings, whoever. You keep thinking if you explain yourself better, sacrifice more, stay patient longer, succeed harder, become easier to love somehow, eventually they'll treat you differently. Most of the time, they won't. That realization sounds depressing at first. Then it becomes freeing, because once you stop auditioning for love, your entire nervous system changes. You sleep better. You breathe differently. You stop checking your phone with anxiety every time certain names appear on the screen. You stop building your identity around being useful. That last one took me a while. For most of my life, usefulness was how I earned value inside my family. I was the reliable one, the organized one, the calm one. The one who fixed problems quietly while everybody else stayed emotionally chaotic. The army rewarded those traits too, honestly. Military culture loves competent people who can function under pressure without complaining. But eventually I had to ask myself something uncomfortable. Who was I when nobody needed rescuing? Turns out I actually liked that person. She paints her living room on weekends. She keeps her pantry organized because it lowers stress. She buys expensive coffee beans now because life is short, and military coffee tastes like legal punishment. She laughs more. Small things started mattering again after cancer. Cooking dinner slowly, folding clean laundry while watching dumb reality TV, sitting on the couch without feeling guilty for resting. Ordinary life became valuable. I think people overlook that too often. Everybody's chasing these huge cinematic ideas of happiness while ignoring the fact most emotionally healthy lives are built from boring routines repeated consistently. Peace is usually repetitive. And honestly, that's beautiful. Another thing nobody tells you about healing is this. Sometimes you have to grieve people who are still alive. That was probably the hardest part for me. My parents still exist. We exchange occasional holiday texts. I know my father eventually had surgery after refinancing the house and liquidating retirement investments. Last I heard, Haley and her husband sold the giant colonial and downsized to a townhouse after reality introduced itself financially. Life kept moving. But emotionally, something ended permanently for me after that meeting at the base. Not because I became cruel. Because I finally accepted reality instead of negotiating with fantasy. I stopped waiting for the version of my parents that only existed in my hopes. That kind of grief is quiet. There's no funeral for it. No casseroles, no sympathy cards. Just gradual acceptance that some people may never become emotionally safe, no matter how badly you wish they would. And acceptance changes everything. Because once you stop trying to force impossible relationships into healthy ones, you finally have energy left to build a healthy life somewhere else. That's what I want people listening to understand most. Your worth is not measured by how much pain you can absorb for other people. Your worth is not determined by how useful you are during family emergencies. And being needed is absolutely not the same thing as being loved. Those are different things. A lot of toxic families confuse them intentionally. Need says, stay because I benefit. Love says, I care what this costs you. Huge difference. Looking back now, I don't think I won because my parents struggled afterward. Their suffering never made me happy. I wouldn't wish medical fear on anybody, not even people who failed me badly. That's important. This story was never about revenge. It was about self-abandonment. For years, I betrayed my own emotional needs to maintain family peace. I tolerated neglect because I thought endurance made me noble. I kept giving access to people who repeatedly proved they would not protect me in return. The real victory happened the day I stopped doing that. The day I realized boundaries are not cruelty. The day I understood dignity sometimes requires disappointing people who feel entitled to your sacrifice. That changed my life more than beating cancer did. And if you're listening right now while struggling with family guilt, toxic loyalty, emotional exhaustion, or the pressure to save people who keep hurting you, I need you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to stop carrying relationships entirely by yourself. And you are absolutely allowed to build a beautiful life that does not revolve around earning basic respect from emotionally selfish people. If this story hit close to home for you, tell me in the comments. I read more of them than you probably think. And if you want more real stories about family, survival, manipulation, boundaries, and rebuilding your life with dignity, subscribe to the channel. There are more people carrying invisible weight than the world realizes. Sometimes hearing somebody else finally put it into words helps.